Chicago is famous for its towering buildings and scenic waterfront. But it's also known around the world as Gangland. After it was burned to the ground in the Great Chicago Fire, it was quickly rebuilt as a busy port city, ruled by mobsters, thugs, and thieves. Today, that secret past is buried just beneath the surface.
Watch your head.
From underground mob dens where America's most notorious criminals ruled the underworld.
These were like secret rooms that you could have like wild parties.
So there was a stash down here of some booze.
To a hidden subway system built by crooked politicians at City Hall.
And the railroad tracks would come right in here.
And the watery grave of Chicago's lost fleet.
This could be a grave here. They might still be entombed in the hole.
Even a highly classified nuclear lab where the world's first controlled nuclear chain reaction shook the earth. Chicago's past is filled with crime, corruption, and scandal, all hidden just beneath the streets. We're peeling back the layers of time on Cities of the Underworld. Mob Underground. With almost 3 million people, Chicago is America's third largest city. Today, it's known as a big city with a small town feel, but it still hides plenty of secrets underground. I'm Don Wildman. I'm in Chicago, Illinois. It's called the Second City for a reason. Over the past 150 years, Chicago has had to rebuild itself again and again as massive fires almost wiped it off the map and floods nearly drowned the city in its own sewage. But rebuilding a city from the ground up is not easy. And in its rush to rebuild, Chicago went from a burned-out wasteland to a booming empire of crime. In time, the city was run by a corrupt secret society called the Grey Wolves and by violent mobsters like Al Capone. They ran their criminal empire through a complex system of secret underground tunnels and escape routes. Today, Chicago is the gleaming capital of America's heartland. But dig beneath the streets, and you'll soon find the foundations were laid by America's most notorious men. By the early 20th century, Chicago was a big city version of the Wild West. By 1919, a pimp named Big Jim Colosimo was slowly taking over the city's criminal activity. But he needed some muscle to support his growing empire. So he hired his nephew from New York, Johnny the Fox Torrio, and Johnny's #1 captain, a young hoodlum named Al Capone. Capone and Johnny the Fox quickly rose in the ranks of the Chicago mob. But a rift between Jim and his protégés developed when Big Jim refused to enter the bootlegging trade. And then he turned up dead. Many believe it was Capone and Johnny who had Big Jim Colosimo whacked. Soon, Chicago's streets were flowing with booze. Capone was now king of Chicago's underworld. Al Capone owned joints throughout the city, speakeasies, casinos, brothels, and in the early 1920s, he took over one of Chicago's most popular nightclubs, the Green Mill, and tapped his most loyal lieutenant, Machine Gun Jack McKern, to run it. He knew it wouldn't be long before Elliot Ness and the Untouchables would start to raid his new hangout. He needed a foolproof escape plan. So he had a network of tunnels connecting to hideouts throughout the city. These tunnels helped him avoid arrest, move his illegal booze, and build his criminal empire. The biggest threat to Capone's criminal empire was the Untouchables, an elite task force that was formed to bring Al Capone to his knees. Elliot Ness began an all-out war against Chicago's greatest criminal empire, tracking Capone's every move and raiding his businesses. But even while he was being hunted, Capone continued to expand his illegal supply routes. Eventually, he found himself targeted by both the Untouchables and rival gangsters like George Bugs Moran. So he needed the perfect protection for himself and his business, and he found it underground. Dave Jamillo, owner of the Green Mill, one of Capone's hotspots, agreed to take me down into Capone's private underworld.
So who owned this place back then?
Well, during Prohibition, one of the owners was Machine Gun Jack McGurn.
Okay.
Who's not Irish. He was Italian. That was just a fake name.
So they
they couldn't sell booze legally, obviously.
Well, that's why he was here.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was he was one of Al Capone's henchmen, and so that was how they got the liquor in.
Machine Gun Jack McGurn was one of Capone's top lieutenants, feared by cops and mobsters alike. It's said that after his father was killed by the mob, McGurn soaked his hands in his father's blood and swore to avenge his death. Because his top lieutenant was running the show, and because he was Chicago's most dangerous VIP, Capone had the best seat in the house.
Don, see this booth here? This is where Al Capone used to sit.
This is Al's booth.
Yeah, because if you sit here, you could see both doors, and a mobster never wants his back to the door. McGurn, you know, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, you know, he's the guy that did it for Al Capone.
Really?
And he owned this joint when he did it.
The popular Green Mill provided an excellent cover for Capone's bootlegging.
Come on down this way.
But Elliot Ness and the Untouchables were tapping his phones and raiding his breweries.
Watch your head.
So Capone supposedly transformed the club's basement into secret vice lounges and an elaborate maze of escape tunnels.
Okay, come on down this way. This is high-tech security. I think Machine Gun Jack McGurn put it in because he knew a lot of thieves.
You get in a lot of trouble back then.
Yeah. Okay, watch your head.
All right.
This is the old women's dressing room here.
Oh, yeah.
Over 80 years ago, these bathrooms and stalls would have been surrounded by performers preparing for the show above. But there's more here than meets the eye. If Elliot Ness and his agents got this far, they'd never suspect that this was only the first section of a more elaborate passageway. Hidden behind this thick steel door was where Capone and McGurn's exclusive underworld began.
It's a cool door, huh? All right, come on this way.
This place just goes on and on, doesn't it?
This extensive passage was the Green Mill's best-kept secret. At first, it appeared to be just a backstage for the jazz club up above. But beyond the hidden door, there were private party rooms with easy escape routes to the streets above. With an extensive subterranean route, booze, women, and the Green Mill's upscale clients could move freely around the tunnels without being caught. If Ness and his agents managed to find this hidden underground, the Untouchables would find nothing but empty passageways. Just as popular as the jazz and dancing up above were the private rooms Capone concealed for his VIPs.
Now you see all these doors on each side of the hallway. From what I'm told, these were like secret rooms that you could have like wild parties.
Really?
Because at the time, if it ever got busted, there's ways of getting out of here that you end up walking on the street with your dame on your arm like nothing ever happened.
So there's exits that go straight up to the street from underneath?
Yeah.
Can we see one of them?
No, I don't want to get robbed, so I'm not going to show them to you.
For security reasons, Dave wouldn't allow us to film the entrances. But in the old days, criminals were welcomed in these tunnels, using them for parties or to escape a raid. But that's not all. The main passageway extended to become a liquor supply route for Chicago's finest theaters and clubs around the city.
Come on over here.
This place is huge. Oh, look at that. Yeah. Well, there you go. There's a secret passageway if ever there was one. Let's just take a look at this.
Hollow. Yeah, there's something behind there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, look, this has been, a board's just been planted in here and the concrete poured like so. So this tunnel went straight across the street. How far?
Supposedly to the Aragon Ballroom, which would be a half a block down.
From the basement of the Green Mill, patrons, criminals, and booze could be transported to the Aragon Ballroom and other clubs around the neighborhood, all underground. These supply routes were Capone's greatest success. In 1927, his total worth was $100 million. That's over $1 billion today. Most of it, cash. Ness never realized so much money was flowing beneath his feet. In just 10 years, Al Capone built an empire through these underground tunnels and speakeasies. But in 1931, Ness won his long battle against the mob. A federal court convicted Capone of tax evasion. Capone pled guilty and was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, never returning to Chicago until he was buried there in 1947.
I mean, this is a grim space. It reminds you how Chicago were filled with killers and graft and illegal activities and booking and everything. It's amazing what might have built this city to start with.
Capone was gangland's most ruthless mobster. But he wasn't the only crook making a killing in Chicago's seedy underworld. Beneath the city's most notorious district, a maze of tunnels kept the booze flowing and the cops at bay. Chicago has the most bars per capita of any major U.S. city. By the 1920s, Chicago had earned the nickname Gangland because it was run by violent gangsters like Al Capone and George Bugs Moran. They had capitalized on the tragedy of the Great Chicago Fire and built a city of crime on the ashes. The Chicago mob had extended its criminal empire throughout the city, from high-class clubs in the North End to dingy basement brothels on the South Side. But within crime-ridden Chicago, there was one district that became command central for criminals of all kinds. Petty thieves, prostitutes, and pimps. And even Capone, the king of Chicago's seedy underworld. This is the near South Side of Chicago. Today, it's a prosperous neighborhood filled with museums, bookstores, and cafes. But if I was walking down this street 80 years ago, I'd be surrounded by prostitutes, pimps, drunks, and the nation's most dangerous criminals. And if you looked a little harder, you'd see politicians and businessmen. You see, in old Chicago, there was one place where the city's elite could rub elbows with mobsters and crooks: the underground. Today, it's called the Near South Side, but in the early 20th century, it was called the Levee District, and it was the most notorious spot in Chicago. City aldermen who ran the levee were as crooked as the thugs on the street. Not only did city officials allow gambling parlors, brothels, and speakeasies in their district, they took a cut of the profit. At one point, there were over 100 dens of vice operating in the levee, and one of its most infamous businesses was the Cullerton Hotel.
Hey, Richard. Hi, Dan. Nice to see you.
You too. Local mob expert Richard Lindbergh was going to take me inside. Today, the old lobby of the hotel is an auto parts store, but over 100 years ago, this was a mob operation. Unlike other illegal enterprises, this one had it all: women, booze, and gambling.
These are the doorway, the gateway to the tunnels underneath the Cullerton Hotel, which connected to the other brothels and illegal places of the Levee District way back when.
Oh, man, look at that.
This is a hidden passageway. Be very careful. The stairs are very narrow, and the wood is very old.
Oh, yeah, it's got that basement smell, doesn't it? Huh. Boy, look at this old stonework.
During the early days of the Chicago mob, this underworld was packed with gamblers, hiding beneath the guise of a legitimate hotel.
And I would imagine quite a glamorous space. I mean, they would have wanted you to feel like you were having a good time.
It was more of a penny ante kind of thing with what they used to call the dinner pail gamblers. That is the men who carried a dinner pail to work and stopped off here after a long day of toil, where they would wager away their last meager paycheck. So they
upstairs on their girlfriend, downstairs on their favorite game.
The Cullerton had been run by the mob for years. Then, in the 1920s, Chicago's newest and most powerful mobster, Al Capone, reportedly took over the Cullerton and the Levee. Capone's hotel was mostly a blue-collar joint, catering to working men in the district. Other places, like the upscale brothel known simply as Casino, catered to high rollers, businessmen, even politicians. But neither high rollers nor working men were safe from the police. Capone ruled the Levee district by paying off most of the police. But not all cops were crooked, and there were still constant raids.
Beginning around 1900, the proprietors of the vice dens in Chicago built a system of tunnels that extend about 6 blocks west of here and 2-3 blocks south and north.
The tunnels are running all through
the tunnel. It's a warren of tunnels that were used as getaways during police raids.
Long before Capone took over the Cullerton, the owners dug out an elaborate tunnel system, providing escape routes in case of a crackdown. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, and these tunnels were the playing field. The Levee district was filled with legitimate businesses that fronted for gambling dens and brothels, and they were secretly connected underground to provide an organized crime front. The police could raid one business, but because the whole neighborhood was connected underground, the police were actually battling the entire district.
Okay, Don, here we go. This is the first of the tunnels of the Cullerton Hotel. It has long ago been plugged up, as you can see. There's layers of stone that have been embedded in here.
Let me use this. Wait, so you're saying all down here?
All down here, this is stone that has been plugged into this entryway.
I see. Oh, yeah, I can see. There's this whole shape of a tunnel right here.
Yes. This was Johnny Torrio's system for hustling people out of the building.
So there's a raid. What's happening upstairs?
Well, you hear the Calliope whistle blaring. The police blast through the front door of the hotel.
Yeah.
The patrons who are in the lobby or elsewhere scurry. Nobody wants to be arrested. They may be jumping out of windows, or more likely they're coming down here into this lower subterranean level, and they're being hustled through here to the street or into another building where they can flee.
Look at this.
When the raids came, there was no time to lose. In fact, there's still evidence inside the Cullerton's secret tunnels that the patrons of this underground racket escaped in a hurry.
So there was a stash down here of some booze. It's amazing. So this is where they're running out, and I'm betting that they're getting rid of their booze.
Yes, it's falling out of their pockets. They're taking a last swig as they go through the tunnel. They're looking over their shoulders to see if the cops are catching up with them, and they flee out and they leave their liquor behind.
The Cullerton Hotel operated for 22 years in the heart of the Levee district. But Al Capone was arrested in 1931. Without his protection and power, the Cullerton and most of the rackets operating in the Levee went under. Legitimate businesses moved in and boarded up the network of tunnels that ran beneath the streets.
This is it for this district. The city of Chicago has taken a rather dim view of its gangster past. They don't want to promote it. They don't want to celebrate it. You're really looking at the last remnant of that era.
I see.
Mobsters ruled the Levee from underground tunnels like these, but they weren't the only ones who were corrupt. Hidden below the city's most famous department store, Chicago's top politicians had their own secret underworld. In 1891, William Wrigley Jr. arrived in Chicago with $32. Today, Wrigley's is the world's largest gum manufacturer, producing more than 20 million packages a day. In the 1920s, gangsters like Big Jim Colosimo and Al Capone helped to make the Levee Chicago's most infamous district. But the Levee had already been a capital of crime for decades. It began after the Great Chicago Fire, with corrupt politicians who were eager to make a quick dollar off a city that was desperate to rebuild. They took bribes from illegal rackets and lured shady businessmen from around the country to set up shop in Chicago's near South Side. It was the beginning of organized crime in the city, the precursor of the Chicago mob. And it all began underground. This is Chicago's famous L train. Every day, 1.5 million people ride these tracks that run high above the city. But there's another railway in Chicago almost no one knows about. It spans 60-plus miles and runs 40 feet underground. It's one of the oldest underground railways in the world, but unlike other subway systems of its day, this was not the pride and joy of the city. This was one of its dark secrets. There were other secret tunnels in Chicago's underworld, but they were nothing compared to the covert subway beneath downtown. What's more, it wasn't built by mobsters in the 1920s. It was built by a corrupt group of politicians in the 1890s. At the time, Chicago's first ward, also known as the Levee District, was run by corrupt aldermen like Michael Hinky-Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin, men who were friends and associates of Big Jim Colosimo, Chicago's most notorious pimp. They were called the Gray Wolves because they preyed on the desperation of a city that had been nearly destroyed by fire, taking payoffs to turn their backs on criminal rackets and to greenlight huge public works projects. One of their biggest scams was a top-secret tunnel system running right under the city. I met up with Richard Limburg again. He's an expert on these rail tunnels, and he brought me to one of the only access points remaining today.
Marshall Field, here we are.
Hey, Don, welcome to Marshall Field.
In the early 1900s, this was the famous Marshall Field store. Today, it's Macy's on State Street. People then and now have never realized that a top-secret railway runs right beneath it.
This is the only access, huh?
This is funny. This is the back of Macy's department store. The only access to these tunnels, apparently.
Okay, Don, let's descend down to the tunnels underneath State Street.
40 feet underground, these tunnels are over 100 years old and run for 60 miles throughout downtown Chicago.
Right over here is the point of entry into the tunnel system, connecting Marshall Fields to the rest of the tracking system. And we're going to open this door. And you'll see right here, this is where the tunnel was located, which would connect to the other downtown streets and the other department stores.
Oh, yeah, look at this. And the railroad tracks would come right in here, right, Richard?
It would come right through this little doorway.
In the 1870s, downtown Chicago was chaos. Wagons, horses, and streetcars were everywhere. Moving supplies around the city was nearly impossible. Building a freight system that could move supplies, coal for heating, and merchandise all underground would be the perfect solution. But with the Gray Wolves in power, getting things done meant cutting a few corners. It was a big moneymaker for the Gray Wolves. Not only did they get bribes to greenlight the rights to build the tunnels, they likely took a cut of the operations fee the tunneling companies charged businesses above. In a time when city councilmen made $200 a year, the Gray Wolves made upwards of $20,000.
We love when a tunnel, when the underground is part of something that's still working. I mean, we got a department store over our heads. We're 40 feet under Chicago, down here in a tunnel that few people know is even here, and has been here for 100 years. So cool.
The tunneling equipment was brought in through the basement of a tavern. To hide the massive construction project, the excavated soil was taken out of the tavern in barrels and carried away in carriages. The workers began digging narrow cavities out of the dense Chicago soil. The tunnels were built to fit small train cars. Then they were temporarily reinforced with wood supports, leaving a small gap between the wood and the soil. Concrete was poured in the gap, and once it set, the wood was removed, and one final layer of concrete was added to smooth the surface. The dense Chicago clay that surrounds the tunnels acts as a natural support, and the classic arch design helps distribute the weight pressing down from above. The completed tunnels were so strong, they still withstand the pressure of today's city up above. Once it was up and running, motor cars transported merchandise, coal, and ash from store to store.
The system began construction in 1899. It was kind of a carefully guarded secret that they were actually going to be building tunnels in here. But the whole system kind of evolved, and as the way Chicago politics usually go, things are done secretly behind closed doors.
Even though the tunnel is out of use, it can still be accessed through the basement of one of Chicago's biggest downtown businesses.
So there was literally a train going through.
Yes, there was a little narrow gauge track that would be right here on the floor. We're standing right on top of it. There would be one motorman driving it.
So this was a delivery system they had built.
It was Chicago's first integrated, organized delivery system.
But these tunnels were only the beginning of Chicago's underground corruption. According to Richard, the Gray Wolves weren't the only ones cashing in on the tunnels. The strong connections between Chicago's corrupt aldermen and the mob may have played a part in this secret subway.
Connection of it went further south, and that really is an interesting side story to this. There were no major department stores that far south. I think a payoff or something was made to get the Chicago Tunnel Company to construct an extension southward to connect with the vice dens of the old levee. And it's probably very likely that the Prohibition bootleggers, be it Al Capone or Dion O'Banion or any of the other ones who were serving their liquor into the downtown hotels, must have used this system.
With the tunnels connecting the levee district to downtown, the illegal liquor that moved freely around the levee could make its way to Chicago's upscale clientele, making the mob more rich and powerful. No one knows for sure whether these tunnels were used by bootleggers, but the seeds of organized crime and corruption had been sown in Chicago. In 1959, the tunnels went out of service, and the city sealed up this secret project. Chicago's underground is filled with secret tunnels like these, but there's another part to the city's dark past. Buried deep at the bottom of Lake Michigan are the ghostly remains of Chicago's lost fleet. The exterior walls of Chicago's Tribune Tower are embedded with pieces of famous buildings, including Westminster Abbey, the Great Pyramid, Taj Mahal, and the Arc de Triomphe. In the mid-1800s, the Port of Chicago was the Grand Central Terminal of waterways. With its canals connecting to the Great Lakes, there was a direct route from the North Atlantic all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. The success of the port turned a frontier town into a center of power. And like all major ports, the incredible value of goods moving in and out of the city made it a haven for illegal cargo and contraband, bribes, and scams. But crime wasn't the only threat on Chicago's busy waterfront. Strong wind currents and sudden violent storms made Lake Michigan a deadly waterway. In fact, there have been rumors that some sea captains used the dangerous waters for a lucrative racket. They sank ships and their cargo to collect insurance money, and sometimes they used the deadly waters as a cover for murder. Evidence of those crimes may still be there, lying at the bottom of Lake Michigan. I went out with shipwreck archaeologist Valerie Van Heest to see a 125-year-old wreck called the Wells Burt. Its disastrous sinking is still a mystery.
Look at that boat over there. That's about a 100-foot schooner. The Wells Burt that we're going to see today is 200 feet. So you can imagine twice the size of that ship there. That's what's laying down on the bottom.
The Wells Burt was a cargo ship and one of the most well-built sailing vessels of its time. 201 feet long, able to hold over 750 tons. But in May of 1883, a monster storm raged across Lake Michigan, just a few miles from the coast of Chicago. The Wells Burt sank, and all 10 crew members and the captain drowned. Many people refuse to believe that such a sturdy ship failed, even in the well-known dangers of Lake Michigan. But was it sinking an accident or murder?
So we're setting anchor here. We're pretty much right over the wreck here, 30 feet over.
5 miles out to sea. The wind's really kind of picking up right here. Conditions have changed totally. This lake just switches just like that.
Lake Michigan is still infamous for its unpredictable weather, so it's no surprise that the lake bottom is one huge graveyard for ships. But weather alone doesn't explain the mystery of the Wells Burt, and there was only one way to get to the bottom of it.
We're doing full face masks, and we got microphones in there so that we can talk to each other. That's cool. I've never done this before.
The wreckage settled right near a reef and is lodged 8 feet into the soft clay bottom, which has kept it from breaking apart in the strong currents. If we can get inside, we'll actually be going beneath the lake bottom itself.
Jacques Cousteau moment.
You ready? Ready. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
The Wells Burt's tragic run was supposed to be a routine trip, starting from Buffalo through the Erie Canal to Chicago. One weekend in May 1883, the city was hit by horrible storms that spawned tornadoes, 30-foot waves, and spray that reached 100 feet high at the city's lakefront. The ship was 2 hours from land when it went down. Within sight of shore, the cargo and crew were sinking without any hope of rescue. The ship's captain had been accused of foul play in a previous shipwreck. If the ship was sunk on purpose in a scam to collect the insurance money, it would make the death of the crew murder.
Valerie, did they ever find the bodies of these sailors?
Well, there was reports of one body washing ashore, but 11 men died on this ship. And I'm afraid they might still be entombed in the hull.
This could be a grave here.
Well, I think this could be a graveyard for 11 men, yes.
But how did the Wells Burt actually sink? The captain was a seasoned veteran, and the ship was a model of solid craftsmanship. But there's evidence that something went terribly wrong on that stormy night in May.
You see anything?
I see no evidence of a rudder.
That's typically what would have brought down a ship in a storm, yeah?
If it lost its rudder and tiller, it would have a very difficult time staying into the waves.
And that's when the water would have built up on the deck.
Valerie suspects that the Wells Burt may have lost its rudder, and the captain suddenly found himself unable to steer in the fierce waves. The Wells Burt should have been able to handle the high waves, unless the ship had a critical design flaw. If it was made without sufficient scuppers, the excess water wouldn't flow out, and the ship would go down.
Valerie, look at this.
I see that. Now that appears to be a scupper.
So this would be what
The
water would have drained out.
time to come out. But to only have one of these in the first half of the ship, that's not enough.
The ship was, in fact, built with scuppers. But according to Valerie, there were not enough to disperse the water crashing onto the deck. If the ship lost its rudder and couldn't steer to avoid the waves, the water would crash high and hard onto the deck. And without enough of these scuppers to let the water escape, the water would slowly fill up the ship and drop her to the bottom of the lake.
This is the hatch for the captain to go below deck. You can in the storm. The whole deck awash with water. In the dark, the waves crashing over. And this captain is trying to get his ship to port. You can only imagine the terror as this heavy ship full of coal, low in the water, just went down.
Valerie believes the sinking of the Wellsburt was an accident caused by a simple but critical design flaw. The rumors of crime and murder have faded, but the truth still lies beneath the bottom of the lake. Today, the Wellsburt remains intact, another well-preserved secret in the depths of Chicago's dark underworld. Whether underground or underwater, Chicago's always been a town that can keep a secret. In fact, the most deadly and highly classified experiment in history took place right here, just beneath the surface. The title Windy City was given to Chicago by New York Sun editor Charles Dana in 1893. He was tired of long-winded politicians boasting about the world's Columbian Exposition held in Chicago that same year. From hidden tunnels to forgotten shipwrecks and an underworld of speakeasies and brothels, Chicago has always been a town that can keep a secret. And when World War II broke out, Chicago was part of the world's most top secret and deadly project in the history of war. The A-bomb.
By December 1942, the race to build the first nuclear weapon was well underway, and the stakes were huge. Hitler's Nazi army had begun its conquest of Europe, and a year earlier, the Japanese had struck the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. It was thought that whoever built the superweapon first would win the war. Meanwhile, a few feet beneath an abandoned football field at the University of Chicago, a group of scientists were getting ready for a test that would begin the age of nuclear warfare and change the world forever.
In 1942, the Manhattan Project was in full force. More than 130,000 employees spread across the country in secret laboratories working day and night to develop an atomic bomb. But few realized it was here in Chicago that the Manhattan Project achieved one of its biggest breakthroughs. An Italian immigrant named Enrico Fermi led a band of wartime scientists, and their testing ground was an old squash court beneath the university's football field. The labs and stadium are gone, but this statue marks the spot where Fermi achieved the world's first controlled nuclear chain reaction, a key stepping stone in building the A-bomb. Professor Hildebrand agreed to show me Fermi's former lab. He's been at the university since 1951 and actually worked side by side with Enrico Fermi.
All right. So you go back to Fermi himself?
Yes. It's one of the great things in my life that I was here while he was alive.
While the war raged overseas, Fermi was here, underground, conducting the nuclear experiments that would end the war. Fermi took the first step in creating the ultimate weapon. The idea was to bombard uranium with neutron particles. When the neutrons hit the uranium, the atoms split apart, releasing more neutrons. That split more uranium atoms and on until a chain reaction would release unprecedented amounts of energy. On December 2nd, 1942, the theory became reality. The uranium pile went critical, and the chain reaction had been achieved. Once this was expanded to a larger scale, it would create a bomb deadly enough to flatten an entire city.
It was a very sober celebration. One of the people standing there had brought a bottle of Chianti. They poured a little bit in everybody's paper cup. They just very solemnly, very quietly drank.
Did they know the profound change they would make in the world?
That's why they were so sober. You have to realize what a terrible war we were in. So this was not a war of choice.
Right.
Just 3 years later, in 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The nuclear race had been won, but at a terrible cost. Today, Fermilab, named after the famous nuclear physicist, still conducts atomic experiments underground. But these scientists are exploring new uses of atomic energy for knowledge about the origins of the universe, not to wage nuclear Armageddon. One of the men exploring this unknown territory is Mike Andrews, a coordinator of the NUMMI beamline at Fermilab. This project studies mysterious particles called neutrinos. Mike and a team of physicists are investigating the hidden properties and power of neutrinos by sending the particles 400 miles through the underground. Because the study of neutrinos is relatively new, researchers are still a long way off from any practical application of their findings. But by learning how neutrinos work, they could get a better understanding of how the universe was formed and how the sun produces its energy.
I'm going to let you wear a hard hat. One of the things we just want to make sure from a safety standpoint that everything goes okay. Let me call the elevator. If you hit the lower button, that'll start our ride.
Is amazing. So that's 360 feet up there.
That's 360 feet. This exists primarily to get every component that's down here came down this shaft. So as you look at everything that's down here, everything came down here by bringing it down by crane down this shaft.
Scientists needed to build this facility underground because neutrinos can be contaminated by cosmic rays. Neutrinos are basic subatomic particles created by radioactive decay and nuclear reactions, like those that take place in the sun. They literally fill the universe, with 10 million of them every cubic foot. They travel at the speed of light, are nearly weightless, and can move through matter uninterrupted. In fact, neutrinos can pass all the way through the Earth. 50 trillion solar neutrinos pass through the human body every second. But how do scientists study particles that are virtually undetectable and can't be contained? Here in the lab, neutrinos are created in a mile-long tunnel 360 feet beneath the surface. A beam of 30 trillion protons hits a target, creating the neutrinos. Researchers use two massive detectors. The one at Fermilab is 980 tons, with 282 steel plates that detect just a few neutrinos as they pass through. From there, the beam of neutrinos passes 450 miles through the Earth to another detector, 2,600 feet underground. A 6,000-ton, 100-foot-long detector in an old mine in Minnesota.
So, basically, after the beam hits our near detector and we take the snapshot of the beam, okay, it travels on to Sudan, Minnesota.
The stream of neutrinos gets sent over 400 miles away.
Yes.
How?
It just goes through the Earth. It continues on its 3% grade. Halfway through Wisconsin, the beam is approximately 10 kilometers deep.
Neutrinos move at the speed of light, so in order to measure any change in the particles over a period of time, the detectors need to be separated by great distances.
So it took 0.25 seconds for those neutrinos to go from here to Minnesota 400 miles away.
A few tenths of a second.
I don't get it.
Few tenths of a second.
That's insane.
And you can't see it.
By studying the difference in the behavior and characteristics of the neutrinos from the time they leave Fermilab to when they arrive in the Minnesota lab, researchers can gain deeper insight into an unknown science.
Everything is impressive here, but this is maybe the deepest hole I've ever looked down into in my life. And somehow this is more representative than anything else here about the length, the distance these guys are going to for pure science.
Today, Mike and the team of scientists at Fermilab are following in the footsteps of Enrico Fermi by tapping into the unknown and mysterious powers of tiny particles. But this massive underground lab is a far cry from the underworld of old Chicago. It evolved from a haven of crime and vice, where gangsters and corrupt politicians ruled the streets, to a modern cosmopolitan city, the pride of America's heartland. But venture below its busy streets, and you'll find Chicago's dark past is still there, buried just beneath the surface.